Just a quick heads up, our next story delves into some sensitive material. Harvey Weinstein. Since the explosive New York Times article came out a couple of weeks ago, more than 40 women have come forward saying he either allegedly sexually harassed or assaulted them. Weinstein's initial response was that he, quote, came of age in the 60s and 70s, when all the rules about behavior in workplaces were different, unquote. As the trickle of women's allegations turned into a deluge, his tune has changed. Now he's reportedly off to rehab for sex addiction and other behavioral issues. And before he left, this is what he told reporters.
Guys, I'm not doing okay.
You're not?
I'm trying. I got to get help, guys. You know what? We all make mistakes. Second chance, I hope. Okay?
And this is where the science comes in. Sex addiction is not officially listed in the Psychiatric Bible of Diagnosable Disorders, the DSM-5. But that hasn't stopped the thousands of people coming forward claiming to be addicted to sexual activity. So, what does the science say? Dr. David Ley is a clinical psychologist in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and author of the book, The Myth of Sex Addiction. And Dr. Eli Coleman is the director of the Sexual Health Program in Human Sexuality at the University of Minnesota Medical School. Dr. Ley, Dr. Coleman, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Thank you.
First of all, Dr. Ley, what goes through your mind when you hear about a rich, powerful man going into rehab for sex addiction?
Well, it's fairly consistent with what we've seen over time. Recent research suggests that 90 to 95% of the people in sex addiction treatment in the United States are men. And around half of them, it appears, are white, heterosexual, married men who make over $100,000. The sex addiction concept has, over the past few decades, become a label that is used by men of privilege to excuse, avoid responsibility for sexual misbehaviors and misconduct. And unfortunately, the American public has kind of bought into it for a long time with the idea that when someone goes away to sex addiction summer camp, we can then pretend that everything is okay and they have paid their price and they're going to be better. But the reality is, and actually the scandal now with Harvey really demonstrates that people aren't buying it anymore and that we expect people in power to be responsible with their sexuality and make good choices.
Well, Dr. Coleman, do you think there's such a thing as sex addiction?
Sex addiction is such an overused and meaningless term. It's used as a metaphor for just about anything. And it's really unfortunate that this is used as extensively it is by people, by the media, but within the scientific community, this is a term that is not accepted. We have a number of models to describe compulsive, impulsive, driven, intense sexual behavior that is out of control. But these models still have not been tested. We have a lot of debate about what they are, but there are many of us who do believe that there is a clinical syndrome. And in the new classification of the World Health Organization that will come out, there's a proposal to include a category of compulsive sexual behavior.
Well, what is it about the word addiction that you think does not apply to sexual behavior?
Well, the problem with the term addiction is that it comes from the old notion of alcohol and drug addiction, that there's some sort of increased tolerance and dependency based upon an interaction with the chemicals in the brain. And this is just not the case with sexual behavior. If anything, sex is a basic appetitive drive. If you want to use an analogy, you would more look to like an eating disorder. And we don't talk about eating addicts or things like that, or treat them in the same way that we treated alcohol and drug addiction.
I think one of the important things in all of this, and I agree so much with Dr. Coleman. I mean, his research and exploration on these areas have really uncovered a lot. But the thing I struggle with in all of these conversations, whether we're using the label compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction, is that there are two problems here. One is there is an idea that there is such a thing as too much sex and that too much sex is bad for people. But in fact, research, for 100 years or more now reveals that high-frequency sex and lots of sex is actually really, really good for people, that it helps them live longer, have healthier lives, healthier relationships, healthier hearts, healthier prostates. But then secondly, that there is an idea in all of this that people don't have the ability to control themselves sexually, that these people who are getting in trouble like this are unable to exert self-control in these situations. And unfortunately, at this point, there's really no data to support that. Multiple studies, one in 2010 in Canada by Jason Winters, another study by Roy Reed at UCLA in California, have shown that these alleged sex addicts have just as much self-control as anyone else, and that there's no neuropsychological evidence that they have impaired self-control when it comes to sexuality. And I think that's the really important thing here. We have this idea that these men are able to exert self-control in other areas of their life, but not sex. But in reality, these individuals, and predominantly men, who are engaging in these problem behaviors, they've got other problems in their life. I mean, Harvey Weinstein, in this case, it is very clear that he engaged, in selfish, kind of destructive, mean, sort of, domineering behaviors in his business practices as well. And sexuality was just one aspect of the way this guy acted. But when we talk about sexual compulsivity or we talk about sexual addiction, we're trying to separate the sexuality from the rest of the person. And we have to understand these people where sexuality is just one behavior.
Well, many people have gone in for sex addiction treatment. So if they're not going through addiction to sex, what is it that they're doing? What's happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sex addiction treatment, one of the dirty secrets that nobody wants to talk about is that after 40 years of the sex addiction model existing, there is not a single published, randomized, controlled, empirically reviewed study that reveals that sex addiction treatment works. Instead, this is an industry that, frankly, is built on snake oil and salesmanship that is, selling the idea to people that they can pay $1,000 a day or more and go to these high-end treatment programs, ride horses, for God's sake, and somehow gain greater control of their sexuality. But the typical treatment is a 12-step model based on the idea of kind of addiction and Alcoholics Anonymous. Guys sit around in groups and they talk about these issues, but they treat all these individuals the same. It is a one-size-fits-all treatment approach. Rather than separating out, hey, this person is having these, behavior problems because they are engaging in sexual narcissism and selfish behavior throughout their life. This person, is a gay or a bisexual man who grew up in a religious family and is really struggling with his same-sex desires that he feels like he doesn't have. This man is using pornography a lot because that's the only way he has to cope with his negative feelings. Those are three very different presentations, and the treatment and response for each of those should be different. But right now, the sex addiction treatment model is offering the same to all of them.
Dr. Lay, do you see any evidence that there is sort of compulsive, obsessive behavior when it comes to sexuality?
Not right now. I mean, I think what we are now seeing is that the majority of people who struggle with controlling their sexual behavior are people who grew up in highly religious, moral families where they now, through the internet and cell phones and everything else, and changes in social attitudes toward sexuality, they now have access to sexual information and experiences that they were not prepared to manage. And now, as they explore or consider expressing those sexualities, it conflicts with their moral values, and they feel bad about it. They feel badly about their difficulties controlling it because they weren't prepared. We didn't give these individuals sex education. We didn't teach them how to understand their sexuality, how to manage it. They struggle, but interestingly, sex addicts in much research don't actually have more sex than anybody else. They feel worse about it. We need to help those folks with the reason they feel worse, and usually it's coming out of this moral or values conflict.
Dr. Coleman?
Yeah, I would like to comment a couple things. First of all, I totally agree with David about, the problem with sex addiction treatment using a 12-step model. I've been very critical of that. And I totally agree with him. Again, the problem is that these kinds of problems are driven by many different mechanisms. And David just mentioned just one of them, and he mentioned three others before. And we really need to have more individualized treatment approaches. And I think that that's also the problem with the research of really finding the exact mechanism, whether there's a failure in executive control or impulse control or mood regulation, is that we take a group of people that have had out of control control sexual behavior, and we try to test them, and then we don't find a lot of differences. But at least in our research, looking at even a heterogeneous population, we can find that there is deficiencies in impulse control compared to their control counterparts. And I think others have really found. And I think that people can have deficiency in one area of functioning, in sexual functioning, and not have problems in other areas as well. So I think that maybe I'm more on the side of really recognizing that this could be a clinical disorder. We don't have enough evidence to really prove all of this, but we see this clinically every day. But I totally agree with David, is that you've got to not just see it as some sort of addiction, but you have to understand what the mechanisms are and then individualize the treatment accordingly.
I think Dr. Coleman said it really well. We need to understand the person, and I think we need to stop saying the sex is the problem. In many of these cases, the problem is heterogeneous, the problem is coming from a lot of different places, and in some cases, frankly, the sex or the porn isn't the problem, the person is. And we need to stop distracting ourselves from addressing the responsibility and the care that people should show as they treat others around a variety of issues, including sexuality. And let's start inviting people to be responsible with their sexual behavior. Unfortunately, in the United States, this is one of the issues that we are struggling with a lot. Sadly, we elected an individual to president who admitted to grabbing women because he could. That is one of the values and the social issues that we really need to challenge and we need to take into consideration, because we can't keep blaming people and blaming the sex when they choose not to control themselves or control their behaviors. We need to look at all of the causes, and our social attitudes towards sex is one of the issues that is playing into this.
This last question is for both of you. Right now, sex addiction or compulsion is not included in the latest Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5. Do you think it should be included? Dr. Coleman?
I think it should be included, and the problem is that there wasn't sufficient evidence to really support, and also because of the debate about what we really can call this, or what part of the DSM we should really put it in.
I think we need to be really, really careful, because, if we are acknowledging that there's no scientific evidence to support that this is a clear syndrome, then I think the idea that we would diagnose it or include it as a medical disorder is frankly unethical and reprehensible. I mean, we have to look at our history of, treating women as nymphomaniacs just because they like sex as much as men. And we did awful things to women. We diagnosed and treated gay men as having a disorder for decades because we thought homosexuality was a disease and illness. And in all of these cases, it turns out it's wrong. So we need to be incredibly careful. And frankly, good medicine should be scientifically driven. And if there's not enough evidence to generate or identify something as a disorder, then it is not scientific and it is not good medicine. And it is frankly potentially damaging to a large group of people to call it that.
Dr. Ley, Dr. Coleman, thank you both for your time.
Well, thank you.
And thank you, Bob. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Dr. David Ley is a clinical psychologist and author of the book, The Myth of Sex Addiction. And Dr. Eli Coleman is the director of the Sexual Health Program and Human Sexuality at the University of Minnesota Medical School.